So I'd like to begin by thanking the Hansa Wissenschaftskolleg and the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, both in Germany, as well as the Australian Research Council for supporting the project from which this paper is drawn. The investigation of how women's greater longevity came to be discovered and assimilated into 19th century French medical thought reveals an apparent paradox in ideas about menopause. It was both not a disease, but also required elaborate hygienic management. In making their anti-pathological insistences about menopause, 19th century French doctors placed great emphasis on what they claimed was a newly recognized fact throughout Europe of women far outnumbering men in the age groups beyond 40 years. 18th and 19th century demographic surveys had apparently revealed that not only were women not more vulnerable to disease after menopause, but were in fact far less likely than men to die around the age of 50. It was on these grounds that doctors insisted there was no need to consider the end of menses a disease risk. Nonetheless, they went to considerable efforts to assimilate women's aging, but very rarely men's, into a matter of hygiene, that peculiar 19th century construct entailed both a wide spectrum of corporeal and behavioral self-management techniques, along with regular visits to the physician. The reflection that demographic data did not support a pathological view of menopause derived not from within 19th century French publications of the great medical faculties of Paris and Montpellier, which certainly claimed it as their own innovation, but from an earlier European-wide network of polymath mathematician demographers of the 17th and 18th centuries, the very same ones who had discovered the longevity differences between the sexes in the first instance. On a European-wide scale, the demographic discovery of women's greater longevity was slowly and unevenly disseminated, in part because population data were both complex to interpret and far from systematically gathered in the 19th century. The Swiss statistician Johann Heinrich Vasa was prosecuted and executed by his state in 1780 for publishing population data on the inhabitants of Zurich. Only in 1817 did a French Interior Ministry initiative permit the publication of sex-differentiated regional birth and death records, fueling a spate of new demographic studies. These were immediately seized upon by French doctors of women's health as fuel for the emerging discourse about menopause as not a disease. By 1850, British medicine too had begun to insist on the need to acknowledge women's greater longevity, which defied pre-existing expectation of the end of menses as a dangerous time. In this case, the stimulus was a slow recognition of the work of the Scottish actuary John Finlayson, who had demonstrated a massive state underestimation of the cost of naval spousal pensions due to previous poor data on women's lifespans. Similar concerns about state annuity funds underlay the search for sex-specific population data in other states as well. Annuity calculations with the focus of both the English mathematician Edmund Halley in his study of the Breslau population of 1693, and of the Dutch demographer Wilhelm Kersenboom in his 1748 study of the population of Amsterdam. In 1746, the French mathematician Antoine Desparcieux published a call for modern states to make use of parish priests to gather local records of births and deaths toward a more accurate determination of annuity calculations. Desparcieux analysed the merits of demographic tables constructed by numerous other scholars for specific towns and regions in England, Switzerland, and the German lands, suggesting a significant improvement which could be made to their methods by differentiating the mortality of men and women, not only that of the different age bands as was the common practice. Desparcieux considered this advisable on the grounds that women were more exposed to mortality risks during their reproductive years on account of the high rates of death during childbirth. He suggested that women's natural life expectancy was skewed in existing data by this variable and could only truly be ascertained by studying populations of women who either had no children or who were already beyond their reproductive years. And he pointed to the earlier data of the Dutch demographer Kersenboom, demonstrating that nuns lived longer than priests. Desparcieux's work was cited in the 1766 work of the Swedish demographer Per Wilhelm Wagentin, who appears to have paid heed to the sex distinction recommendation in his own survey. And in 1758, Desparcieux was elected a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, roughly 10 years after Wagentin had received his respected honour by the French Académie des Sciences. The statistical innovation of counting male and female mortality separately was clearly a transcultural advancement in the history of scientific knowledge. And while French scholars were certainly part of that conversation, they were by no means the unique drivers of it. On the other hand, French physicians were by far the dominant force in a 19th century movement that engaged consistently and explicitly with this earlier scientific innovation of women's longevity, and which referred to concepts of menopause and of sex-specific descriptions of aging and mortality. The most fervently argued of such French insistences appeared with a memoir on mortality presented by the statistician and demographer Louis-François Bonnafont de Châteauneuf at the Académie des Sciences on May 13, 1818. This report specifically targeted the notion that women suffered a so-called critical age at around 45 to 50 years, which Châteauneuf argued was not supported by any of the accumulating mortality statistics of different places in Europe. Châteauneuf later worked in the Ministry of Finance under the Restoration, leaving public life just prior to the ascension of the Emperor Louis-Napoleon III. Prior to this, he had served as a military surgeon in the Napoleonic Wars after training in Paris at the Val-Grace Military Hospital. And he was influenced by the younger mathematician and physician Simeon Denis Poisson, after whom the statistical term the Poisson distribution is named, which is a term used to describe the distribution function of very low probability events. Poisson, in turn, had studied at the École Polytechnique in Paris and had been appointed professor of mechanical reason at the new Paris Faculty of Sciences in 1809, and it seems likely this is where he made Châteauneuf's acquaintance. These were both men trained in the military, whose induction into population statistics was very different from that of the graduates of the Paris Medical Faculty, with their common orientation toward the hygienic care of the urban elites. As such, Châteauneuf, like Poisson, had little truck either with funeral medicine or with Hippocratic aphorisms, which continued to delight medical school graduates and scholars, nor with questions that did not bear upon the hard numerical facts of mortality. These were scholars who looked to more precise disciplines such as mathematics and physics to deduce new understandings of human physiology. With their induction into concerns about military personnel, they were also acutely aware of the state's need for more accurate information about population to determine the number of effectifs, or men able to be recruited for active military service. Around the same time of his paper delivered to the Académie des Sciences, Châteauneuf had also begun preparing a report in 1817 on the mortality of the Paris population, which similarly indicated that women in the nation's capital suffered no particular spike in mortality around the age of 50. He then extended these studies into a Europe-wide survey of mortality, which incorporated the research of Argentine and others from as early as 1775. Châteauneuf's loud, insistent message of the 1820s and 30s was that since there were plenty of French people, women were not to be fussed over just because their reproductive capacity had ended. The facts did not support any special care needed in menopause because it represented no risk according to mortality data. Needless to say, this was well prior to the marked slowing of births that became the worried obsession of French statisticians and demographers from the last decades of the 19th century up until World War II. However, the published version of Châteauneuf's report, released in 1822, contained an extended series of claims about both the universality of women's greater longevity and about menopause symptomatology. Châteauneuf showed himself adept in both forms of discourse that had competed on the question of women's aging up to this time. Both the medical hygienic approach to managing menopause as if it were an illness, even as it was denied to be one, and the statistical mathematical accounts of women's mortality risk, which suggested that they were in no special need of medical supervision in aging. Châteauneuf appears to have provided an example to medical clinicians of how these competing claims could be accommodated by both embracing, even championing, the statistical challenge to outdated concepts of women's fragility, while supporting the role of clinicians in the management of what was now being redefined as a troublesome but not dangerous time of life. Châteauneuf's example appeared to have triggered an entire genre of French medical writers in the 19th century who now insisted on an anti-pathological but ardently hygienic view of menopause. Constance Sausserot was one such doctor who was quick to seize on existing population data reproducing similar tables of mortality in his 1823 work aimed at debunking the idea of women's cessation of menses as representing a particularly dangerous time. From the mid-19th century, many menopause doctors now followed this pattern of explanation and took inspiration from the fact that women's greater longevity to insist on this anthropopathological view and the rejection of the idea that women even had anything that could be considered a critical age. But rather than concluding that menopause was therefore not something that required medical treatment at all, which is a reasonable enough conclusion and one which many people today consider valid, Saussure proposed the matter to demonstrate instead the need for the newly designated discipline of hygiene, elaborated by the young alienist and physician Claude Lachaise, who had devoted a section of his 1822 medical topography of Paris to the apparent inequality of the sexes in their vulnerability to mortality at all ages. Lachaise authored another more grandiose 500-page work in 1825 on the physiological hygiene of women, which revealed why he was considered such an authority on matters of hygiene. The book was divided into separate chapters for the various life phases of women: childhood, puberty, youth, motherhood, the so-called critical age, and old age. He recommended gentle exercise as beneficial to girls in puberty, specifying rides in carriages and on horseback as the two best forms. This earned him the gentle scorn of one reviewer who remarked that it seems our author has in view only the rich people and will occupy himself at another time with the inferior classes of society. For the time being, though, his work remained of special interest aux gens du monde. French demographers too continued to gather further supporting data toward the claims about women's higher life expectancy. Louis Noiret's 1850 study of the lifespan of the Greater Dijonais population, some 24,500 souls, was one such text which was widely cited in French medical works about sex-differentiated aging thereafter. Noiret's corrective to assumptions about the vulnerability of older women was poignantly argued on the basis of his own data on a specific population, the Dijonnais, who were renowned for their greater longevity and healthy lifeways. In his statistical tables, he was able to show higher male birth rates, but also higher male death rates across all ages in the period of his study, including even the reproductive age when women's mortality peaked due to deaths in childbirth. Consequently, he found fewer men than women in the overall adult population, and far higher numbers of women than men among the Dijonnais octogenarians and nonagenarians, 744 women versus 428 men, with only one man surviving among the 8 recorded centenarians. What could this mean? Vainly, he noted, have we searched to explain this phenomenon in depicting the life of men as more stormy, more subject to the influence of destructive agents, charged with tiring labours stimulated by political passions, the butt of wartime misfortunes of all kinds of dangers. However, Noiret considered that there was proof of an inherent physiological sex-determined mortality difference in the evidence from monasteries. Here, priests leading peaceful, protected, and entirely non-combatant lives identical to those of the nuns, nonetheless also died younger. In fact, with the risk of childbirth removed in the study of nuns who constituted a childless female population, overall female life expectancy appeared even more starkly differentiated than that for men. Noiret's work was widely cited by numerous French physicians writing about menopause over the next 80 years. But in the majority of such work, his recommendation to abandon the specific attention to women's aging was not heeded. Moreover, the development of the hygienic approach to menopause remained unique to French physicians throughout much of the 19th century. The news of women's higher life expectancy certainly spread throughout multiple European cultures, but in the 19th century, the notion that women nonetheless needed medical care for menopause remained a distinctly French fixation. Thank you.